Hello, hello. H- How are you?
I'm well, thank you. How are you?
I'm good. It's so good to see you again and chat with you. I feel like the last time when we had a conversation, I think we talked a lot about what we're going to talk about today, but I feel like it was in the context of us, obviously doing a photo shoot. So it felt very much just like little bite-sized pieces. And we had a lot to talk about during that day. So that was really cool and a good insight I think you had. So that's really
Thank you.
nice.
Yeah, I'm excited to flesh it out.
I think there's a lot to talk about. I had a chance to actually read the book the other day on Kindle, and there's a lot that I want to ask you. But before we get to that point, I really want you to introduce yourself to the people so people know who you are a little bit. I know you, but my audience doesn't. So,
Yeah. So my name's Luke Wilson, born and raised in Toronto, Ontario, but I did a lot of schooling, a little bit too much schooling. At a certain point, I had to get out, but I'm still in the university. I'm a postdoctoral fellow, a short postdoctoral fellow at University of Toronto, Mississauga, formerly the Justice, Equity, and Transformation postdoctoral fellow at University of Calgary. And my research mostly up until about a year and a half ago ish, focused on intergenerational trauma, looking at the transmission of trauma between Holocaust survivors and their kids and their grandkids. But I have since shifted gears a wee bit, at least for now. And I'm mostly focusing on white Christian nationalism, specifically the new Christian rights relationship to gender and sexuality in the US, though, of course, there are global connections that we can talk about. But that's what I focus on mostly at this point. That's what I do, and that's in part who I am.
awesome. No, thank you for that. That's a really good and very comprehensive introduction, which is great because you've done a lot and you've experienced a lot. One of the cool things I think that I really enjoyed, even when I was reading just the foreword for your book and kind of your initial introduction into the book, is just how much you've actually accomplished, which I think is really, really commendable given the time and what you've been able to do. So a lot of that really I know you, but that made me know you all the more. And that was really, really insightful for me. One of the things that I think, you've talked a lot about in your book and you've talked a lot about, as a whole is this idea about your experience with conversion therapy, but also the book itself talks a lot about other people's experiences with conversion therapy, which was really nice because there was a nice breadth to experience. And I think, everyone obviously can relate, maybe in someone else's story or your story. What actually initially inspired you to want to write about your experience with conversion therapy and then also then introduce more voices into that?
So initially, I again, so being within the academy, most of my writing really has been academic, and there was a certain point when I was in the field of literary criticism. I focused most of my work at the time on literature, of again the children of survivors as well as survivors, and as well, also their survivors' grandchildren. And so for me, I was doing this work and I went to Liberty University. And, for folks who don't know what that is, that's the world's largest evangelical university located in Lynchburg, Virginia. There's so much, of course, to say about the name Lynchburg. We'll put a pin in that for now. And so I was hella evangelical for a long time. By the time I got to grad school, I started to deconvert, and halfway through grad school, I was no longer, an evangelical, no longer a person of faith.
Mm-hmm.
And we could talk more about the spiritual journey, but or sort of the exit from that spiritual journey. And I think for me, at a certain point when I was in grad school, I didn't want people to see my CV and see Liberty University and immediately assume that I was, this crazy evangelical. And so I actually wrote this article. It was like an op-ed for Queerty. This would have been in 2020. I wrote an op-ed just detailing my experience at Liberty, and I had to have a focus. And so I focused on my experience in conversion therapy. And this was really a way to separate myself from the university, to say like, hey, that was me then. This is who I am now, not the same person. And so that really was why I started writing about this topic. But as I wrote about that, or when that article came out, there was a really, for me at least at the time, there was a big response. And there were a number of people who were reaching out to me saying, hey, I'm queer at Liberty now, or I went to Liberty as well, and I went through conversion therapy, et cetera, et cetera. And so I started writing more op-eds about my time there, and then also just about the university in general. And then if we fast forward to about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, I was at the STI clinic getting a routine checkup. Sexual health is important. And so
Super
I was
important.
there, super important. And so I was there, and on my phone on Twitter, or the artist formerly known as Twitter, I get this message from this editor. And at first I thought it was a scam. Like I was like, there's no way that like an editor is reaching out to me on Twitter. But certainly it turned out that this was a real, legitimate offer. And the offer was for me to put together a collection of stories about conversion therapy. And up until that point, that editor from this press, and I looked up both of them to see like, who the heck are these? Who's this editor? What's this press? And once I realized it was legitimate, I said, sure, of course, like who am I to say no? And on top of that, it had been something that, again, I had been writing about creatively, a little bit academically at that point. Now that really is my focus academically as well. But up until that point, it wasn't necessarily my main focus, or it had not been up until that point. So I negotiated with the press and said, I want to make sure that there are only survivors' voices included. The recent representation of conversion therapy has really focused either on the perpetrators of conversion therapy or conversion practices, or has focused on fictional accounts, should I say. And so I said, I want these to be non-fictional. I want these to be, testimonial narratives about what folks went through. And so that's how it started. So, a call for submissions. People submitted. I worked with authors for multiple rounds on edits, depending on the piece. And then when we all sort of came to a conclusion that, these pieces were where they needed to be publishable, the collection was published, and it came out on February 21st, and is now in the world. I'm very excited about it.
It is. I feel like, what I think you've really done with it too, just by doing and incorporating these voices, is really shown that conversion therapy is not that traditional definition of conversion therapy. The one thing I think a lot of people, I feel like, myself included, I assumed that there was a very specific, kind of process. There's a very specific way in which it happens. But the one thing I realized whilst reading it was that it literally there is a spectrum, and what it actually means and how it actually manifests is so varied. And the reasons it manifests is also so varied. But one thing I also really liked that you kind of highlight throughout a lot of the stories is that there is a motivation behind conversion therapy, whether the impetus is like a parent kind of trying to avoid, their child kind of going down the wrong path, or it is the child themselves feeling like, I have some sort of a secret and I need to correct for it, right? And that's the idea of shame. And one thing I really loved was that exploration of how shame is one of those motivating factors. Talk a little bit more about how shame became kind of like this underlying theme for the book.
Yeah, so what I always say now, and the collection, I should say, I haven't even said it, but the name is Shame, Sex, Attraction, Survivor Stories of Conversion Therapy. And so shame is what, I always say that it's both what brings people into conversion therapy and is the number one export from conversion therapy. So, again, no one goes to conversion therapy willingly unless they feel a heavy measure of shame, that they feel that they themselves are dirty, are defective, are disordered, are a problem. And of course, when you see yourself as a problem, that's a problem. And so this is what brings people in. Again, there are people who go to conversion therapy and they're just trying to, buy their time and get in and out so that they can appease their parents or whoever sent them, right? And they don't necessarily feel these feelings of shame. But again, those are the exception, not the rule. So the other thing is when one goes to conversion therapy, that shame that one has felt for, however long, oftentimes throughout their entire lives, as queer people are made to feel bad about themselves. And shame is, of course, a social affect. It's a social emotion, right? That one does not feel ashamed unless one is seen in the eyes of another as bad. And then that image from, or how that one perceives, an individual is then mapped onto the individual's sense of self. So what happens is conversion therapy amplifies this shame, right? It augments this shame to such an extent that, not always do people feel necessarily too bad in the moment when one's in conversion therapy. And I can give you my story as an example in just a moment, but really what happens oftentimes is that shame is amplified afterwards. And so to give you, a little bit of an illustration, for me, when I went to conversion therapy, I went into conversion therapy because I was ashamed of who I was. My conversion therapist, though, and this was at Liberty University, this is, at that wildly, just that wild evangelical university in the States. And I was there and I met with this man by the name of Pastor Dane Emmerich. He was a paid university employee who was tasked with two things. helping those who were addicted to porn. Of course, no one's addicted to porn. That's not an actual thing. It's never been a thing, and it never will be a thing. And there's a lot of research to back that up. But then on top of that, those who are addicted to homosexuality, and of course, homosexuality within the evangelical tradition is oftentimes framed as an addiction. So I was there meeting with him. And, what he tried to do, and to his credit, I mean, he was wildly misguided and, a wildly dangerous man. But he did believe that he was doing what God wanted him to do. And he believed, as an ex-gay, of course, also known as a gay, who just pretends that he's not, as an ex-gay, he was claiming that what he was trying to do was get rid of the shame that we felt. And I do believe that he meant that. I think that he really was trying to say, hey, although you have felt throughout your life that you are, again, dirty, disgusting, whatever, that I'm going to do my best to really not have you feel shame, but to feel guilt. And of course, the difference between guilt and shame is distinct. And the distinction is that for guilt, it's like, oh, I've done one thing bad. I stole a candy. Oh, slap my hand on the wrist, go to court, be told I have a $10 fine, pay that fine, and everything's good and God's on God's throne. The other thing is, though, if I've done something wrong, and I don't just think that I did something wrong, but that action therefore defines me as a person, that I myself am bad and gross and dirty and disgusting, whatever. That's the difference between shame and guilt. So I do think he was trying to alleviate me of that guilt, obviously, or that shame, should I say, and just make me feel bad for the moments that I slipped up, which was moments that I gave into temptation. For me, and in the moment, it felt quite good, right? Like I did really feel like, okay, I'm here with Dane. We're meeting, every time I'm doing better, I'm finding, more victory over my sin, and eventually I'll become straight. That day never came, obviously, but here we are. So for him though, or for me, I should say, the violence of conversion therapy and the shame that I felt didn't come in the moment, it came afterwards. And that was because when I left Liberty, I went to McMaster for my master's in English. And I was there, and, I'm still, giving it the good old college try, trying to become straight, and nothing's changing. And within the evangelical tradition, God's considered perfect. And so if God's perfect and God wants me to change and I'm not changing, the problem obviously isn't God. The problem's obviously me, again, within this religious system. So I thought that again, it was like, okay, but like I did everything I was supposed to. I read my Bible, I pray, I fast. I fasted for literally, if you count up the weeks that I fasted, it would have been months that I just didn't eat. Not obviously at the same time, but over the span of a few years. And I went and met with Pastor Dane because I didn't understand my experience as conversion therapy. I understood it as pastoral counseling. And so I was like, God, what the hell? If you want me to change and I'm not changing, again, obviously the problem's me. And when you see yourself as a problem, that's a huge problem. So for me, that's when the shame really kicked in, and that shame really turned into self-hatred. That self-hatred turned self-abnegation, and just this sort of like spiral of negative affect or emotion that really took over my life for quite some time, and it took a long time to undo. And so that for me is an example of, how shame is not just that which brings folks in, but also that which is a consequence of conversion practices.
And that's the fascinating part for me. One of the things that I took away when reading a lot of these stories was that the grasp is not just in the moment. The grasp is so far reaching. So even if you have decided to distance yourself, there's still this element that something will bring you back. And that kind of dominance, especially when it comes from a religious institution, I feel like shame is a tool for that dominance over your life, right? Just like guilt can be as well. And one of the key things for me that was really fascinating was just how powerful it is. Like at the end of the day, you have taken over someone's mind in many ways by doing this. And then, you're literally like, I feel like in many ways, there's a lot of irreparable damage that can happen because of this, right? One of the things I liked when I read your story in particular is that, you used humor to sort of process a lot of what's happening. And that felt very true to the person that I've met in real life, because that was very much your personality. But when it came to actually finding ways and avenues to try to kind of break away from this shame that hadn't obviously been so ingrained into you, how did things like, did faith in any way play a part in this? Did you distance yourself from faith? Is faith still a part of your life in any way?
Yeah, so for me, I wouldn't say faith was an avenue to work through or come to terms with the shame, but it was certainly something that that led me. I guess maybe it led me there. It just wasn't the avenue that I actually took to come to terms with what happened, in the sense that when I got to McMaster, I was there, and again, wildly unmoored. I had just moved back to Canada. I, was finally at an institution that really taught me like real academic sort of discourse. At Liberty, it was, as one can, sort of guess, the evangelical education was abysmal and left one wanting. And when I got to McMaster, I was wildly far behind.
Mm-hmm.
So I was struggling when it came to academics, and I was trying to, come up to where I needed to be academically. I was also struggling with my reconciling my faith and my sexuality. Again, finally, I was out of this system and put back into the real world and really struggling to reconcile the two. So I decided that I wanted to study religion for a little bit longer. Or to actually study religion, I should say, because up until that point, my 2 degrees were in English. So I went to Vanderbilt. I went down to Nashville. And I was there and I did my master's in theological studies. It really wasn't too much theology. It was actually a lot more religious studies, but whatever. But it was there that I really decided that I wanted to figure out how did I understand my faith in relationship to my sexuality and vice versa. And for the first time, I decided that I wasn't going to put my theory first. I was going to live first. And what I mean by that is that within the evangelical tradition, you put your theology first. That's what determines every single goddamn action that you do, or it's supposed to, right? And, you think, okay, God says this, Jesus says this, or the Bible says that Jesus says this, or at least I interpret the Bible to say that Jesus, anyway, it's just ridiculous mental gymnastics. But, that you put that first and then you say, okay, this is going to determine how I live my life. But I was like, you know what? I have tried that, and that seemingly, not seemingly, obviously didn't work. Let me instead try to live my life and then see how my lived experience bears upon, or bears on, should I say, my theology. So I switched it up a little bit. And so that, I started going to the gay club. I started going to, this is like when Brooklyn Heights, before she was on Drag Race, this is where she was, right? And Cameron Michaels and blah, blah, blah. And so I go to the gay club. I started, living as an out gay man. And that really was such a paradigm shift. I think for people outside of the evangelicalism, it's hard to conceptualize how big of a shift that was and what that actually means to put your theory first, as opposed to putting your lived experiences first. And so, but for me, it was groundbreaking. And so I was there both trying to put my, allow myself just to live. And then on top of that, actually pursuing real study and pursuing real academic research, that changed how I thought. Like I realized so much of what I had been taught was just bogus. So much of what I had been taught was so dangerous. And I started to undo the way that I had sort of thought and deconstruct the faith that I had built for myself, or had been built for me more accurately. And so, for me, it wasn't so much my sexuality at the end of the day that really got me out of the church. It was more so actually my research on the Holocaust. And, that is its own story. But I think a lot of times people think that, it's people's sexuality that's going to take them out of the church. And for a good number of people, it is. And that's a valid reason. But for me, it just simply wasn't, because I was still at the time invested in remaining a committed person of faith. But once I got to my research and once I got to reading a lot of different voices that differed from my own, I started to realize, oh gosh, I just don't believe this. And it's just a bunch of, gobbledygook at the end of the day. And I freed myself, or was freed by academia.
That's the interesting thing. And the reason I actually brought up this question a lot is, I've had moments obviously with my own faith where I've questioned my own faith. And one of the reasons I really distanced myself from faith was mainly because of the fact that I did not feel seen by my own faith, despite existing within the ecosystem and, maybe being a practicing individual. A lot of it did not feel true to who I was. And I think that, in your circumstances, obviously a little bit different, because there is also an imposition of power that's been taking place within the faith itself. I was maybe a little bit more, it was not necessarily as imposed on me. And I was very curious to know, whether or not faith had any kind of residual kind of existence in your life. Because I mean, for me, I completely was like, you know what, I'm out, we're not doing this. We're on to new things. So that's kind of really why I brought up the question. But I like that education was also your biggest savior. And I think it's one of the things that you have actually kind of focused a lot more on. And I think you talked a little bit about this in the book too, what led you to study. Why was it education? Why was it understanding these different perspectives? Why were all those reasons why you now have such a broader or better understanding of where you're at today?
I think within evangelicalism, it is in part defined by its anti-intellectualism, right? Like it is very much resistant or allergic to difference of thought, just different people, diversity, equity, and inclusion. These are bad words within the evangelical tradition, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so for me, up until that point, I had really, I mean, I wasn't raised in the church. That's another thing too. I was raised in a pretty average-ish Canadian family, which most Canadians are just sort of like nothing, right? Like we don't really believe a lot of things, and thank God. My dad was agnostic. My mom, I would say that my mom was haunted by her Baptist demons, so that definitely affected me for sure. But I had my dad, and my dad was, this like hippity dippity pot smoking, like record store owner. He was also a social worker, like wrote a book on Bob Dylan. Like he was just a cool guy. And so I didn't really I've always had one foot in, one foot out. Though I would say more so I had more of my foot in. Just because, within the evangelical tradition, it consumes your entire life. So it took over in a lot of ways. But again, there was always that little bit of critical distance that allowed me to get the hell out. But I think that because it's anti-intellectual, finally engaging with people who were intellectual, and finally engaging with people whose views were different from my own. And again, I went to like Roseau Heights School of the Arts. I grew up in Toronto, and so I encountered a lot of difference, and a lot of my friends were very different from me. And that was phenomenal. But I didn't really have necessarily academic conversations with these folks, right? And so once I was in a very dedicated space to having, structured conversations about a text or ideas or theories or whatever, that for me started to push me outside of my paradigm, or at least show me that my paradigm had holes, flaws, and inconsistencies. And really for me, it was the Jewish authors that I had was reading, and these were, and specifically I'm thinking of Elie Wiesel. Elie Wiesel, a Nobel Prize winner, wrote Night. What perhaps other than perhaps the best known Holocaust survivor out there, died a few years ago, unfortunately. But he was what's the word? He incessantly questioned God, and it's funny because Protestantism and evangelicalism falls under the umbrella of Protestantism. It's defined by its protest, Protestant protests. They were protesting the Catholic Church. Yet what you find today is that no one protests anything other than the liberals and woke ideology, whatever they term it as. But they don't protest God. They don't protest anything within the faith, because God's right and we're wrong always. And everything we always have to choose God over ourselves. And again, God is perfect, therefore who are we? So reading Wiesel and his protest against God, like he was like, there's this one New York Times op-ed that he wrote where he was like, God, let's just get to the bottom of this. Essentially, why the hell did you let the Holocaust happen? Let's talk about it. Let's chat it out. And, and I remember sitting there reading, but like, oh my God, like, listen to him. He's talking to God like that. Who does he think he is? But it was seeing Wiesel protest over and over and over in this sort of like insistent way that really pushed me to think, I can do the same. And that for me opened a door, at least. And I eventually walked through it, but it was in the beginning scary to exit this world, because that world of evangelicalism is so structured around the binary, right, wrong, good, evil, of God, of the enemy. There's an answer for everything. It's comfortable. It's safe. And so to go outside of that, to question God and to say, like, I'm also an authority based on, well, in part my own experience. And God, who are you? Just because you apparently created me. And so it's sort of all unraveled. And for me, that was really what saved me. And that's how academia got me out, because it allowed me to ask questions that theretofore I had not asked. It gave me the tools to think through, again, the inconsistencies and the errors and, the ridiculousness of this religious tradition. And so I always say that academia saved my life, because without it, I'd probably be married to a woman with children, living an unbelievably unhappy life, and would probably eventually, by the time I was 40, have left that life and felt like I'd wasted so many years. And I still feel like I wasted a number of years, but at least I was 25, 26, 27 when I got the hell out.
No, that's exceptional. Like, I think one of the things that I really, really loved that you've included in there, is the fact that you need to constantly be inquisitive, and you need to have this constant inquiry, right? And I think that's the power of education. Like, I think education teaches you to be curious. It teaches you that it's okay to ask and to find out and to discover, right? One of the key things I think I keep repeating to a lot of people around me is that, I cannot accept faith blindly anymore. If you're going to come and say that something is a belief to me, I need to actually like be able to critique it and critique it to break it, to understand why, right? And maybe in the breaking, I discover the reason behind its existence, but maybe in the breaking, I understand that this is not necessarily true or for me. But I think to blindly accept that there is a God that is doing all these things, it's just, there's just a flaw, there's a fallacy in all of it. And I think that being constantly inquisitive is really, really key. So I really love that education was able to do that for you and kind of like draw you out and kind of like bring you into that world of inquiry. And so that's, I think, in many ways, like kudos to school. Right.
We love school, but you know what? But to your point, it's just like if you have a faith that isn't worth questioning, then or if you have a faith that won't stand up to questions, pardon me, it's not a faith worth having, right? And I think that
100%. Like the thing is, like when it comes to any element of trust, even with people, with anything that you're going to do in your life, you will constantly inquire. Right? You will wonder why you're in a relationship. You'll wonder why you're in a job, and you will be able to ask yourself those questions and make the change. Why can the same not apply to your faith? Because if you are investing so much of your time, so much of your life, like you described, in something, and you are not able to justify why this is happening for you and what the motivations are behind it, except for the fact that there is an element of hope, community, aspiration that comes with it, right? That's a huge gap. Like you need to be able to constantly say to yourself, anything that I do, I should be able to wonder why I'm doing it, and when it continues to be a part of my life, and when it stops being a part of my life, right? So I really like that you have that ability to question now, which I think is really, really key. With the release of this particular book, I was actually wondering what you were hoping the impact will be of the book and what you're hoping to do next with the book itself.
Yeah, so the impact, people always say like, oh, this is what's going to help end conversion therapy. And I'm like, no, it's not. Like, I would love for that to be, what happens with this book. Obviously, like, I don't want anyone to go through this. However, it's simply not going to happen. Like conversion therapy is alive and well, right? Although it's not perhaps as well known, because like you said before, a lot of people don't even realize that this is still a thing. This is still happening. Even in Canada, when I looked, I think it was last year, I looked up, there was an organization like 250 meters from my place in Toronto, this Catholic church that was offering conversion therapy, right? Even though we have this national ban, it doesn't mean that it's not going to happen. Just because, something's illegal doesn't mean that it's not going to happen. Crime will still happen, even if, it is against the law. And so, I have no illusion or delusion that that this book will change, that conversion therapy will be a thing of the past. I again, would love that to be the case. However, being sort of realistic, it won't. However, I do hope that it is helpful in pushing public policy, in pushing, the narrative that, again, even just raising awareness that this still happens so that people can be on the lookout to call, organizations or churches or whatever out for doing what they do and the dirty work that they do. But really my main goal, in addition to that, again, having this book be used for generative purposes, I think another generative purpose is that folks who have undergone conversion practices can read this and see themselves in there and find some sort of solace or come to terms by seeing themselves by way of this representation. Also, I think that a lot of folks who have not necessarily undergone conversion therapy, what I talk about in the introduction of the book is that really a lot of folks, and I would say pretty much every queer person has experienced conversion practices. And there is perhaps a little bit of a distinction there, even though folks are really pushing to talk about everything in terms of the conversion practices, right? Yeah. I don't think that everyone went through conversion therapy the way that, the number of people in the collection did, but all of us have experienced conversion practices. Conversion practices are efforts to change our gender identity or gender expression or sexual orientation. And so for all of us queers, at some point in our lives, when someone told us to sit a certain way, talk a certain way, not talk a certain way, not play with that, not do this, whatever, these are conversion practices. So I think that queer folks, when they read this book, will be able to see themselves in some way, shape, or form as well, right? It's not just those of us who have undergone conversion therapy, but all of us who have undergone conversion practices. So that's what I'm hoping for the book. As for what I hope to do with this book, I would love to be honest, really work with a lot of organizations, whether it be churches, and I mean affirming churches. I don't think many homophobic or transphobic churches are really going to want me in their, sanctuary. But when it comes to affirming churches, I would love to work with them. Although I'm not a person of faith anymore, I know the faith pretty well. And my goal is not really even to convince them not to be people of faith. It's just for them to be better people of faith. And, if that means that I go to an organization that, again, maybe they're religious or not, that this book can be used in some way, shape, or form to be in some ways a springboard to talk about sexuality, to talk about gender, to talk about high control religious groups, whatever it might be. So really, I would love to partner with anyone at this point, and any organization that wants to talk about these things. And the book could be that, again, that avenue to talk about these topics.
I'm really hoping that at least someone who actually is in one of these organizations hears it, because I think that is the key, right? The conversation is everything. I think the knowledge is everything. The way that you expanded your breadth of knowledge to actually understand yourself and this world a little bit better, a lot of people still need to get to that point. And I think that's really the power for me of this book, right? Is the fact that you have given us perspective. You have given us something to think about. You have given us this that it's okay to ask questions, that it's okay to be a certain way. And it's okay to look at certain things a little bit more critically that maybe we took for granted, right? Like those practices you mentioned. So that's really, really important. Any final words for the audience that you'd like to leave us with?
Oh, goodness. I don't know. I mean, my next project, I'm working on a collection of stories about Christian or college, or pardon me, let's start that one again, about queer experiences at Christian colleges, universities, and or seminaries. And so if anyone has a story and wants to be considered, the deadline is April 15th. So a shameless plug for my next project. Yeah.
Awesome. No, this was really, really great. And I had so much, insight just in this conversation alone, just in us talking. And this is why I wanted to do this with you. I feel like there is so much that you can share with us. And so thank you again for taking time to do this with me. I had a blast. I hope you did too.
I definitely did. Thank you so much for having me.
And hopefully we'll do this again soon.
I'd love that. You too.